She watched him cross a room full of strangers, and something inside her completely gave way. Not because she was heartbroken, not because she was grieving, but because the young man moving through those lights had grown into someone she barely recognized anymore. Terri Irwin has weathered some of the heaviest storms a person can face: the loss of a husband, the weight of single motherhood, the pressure of protecting a legacy the whole world was watching. But when she saw who Robert had quietly grown into, something deep inside her cracked wide open. Nobody had predicted this version of him, but she had prayed for it. Let's set the scene. It's a black tie gala in Sydney, the kind of event where champagne flows freely, designer suits cost more than most people's rent, and the guest list reads like a who's who of Australian society. These are not people who get easily impressed. Terri is there doing what she has done for the better part of 2 decades, holding it all together. She is the face of the conservation mission, the living keeper of a flame that the world almost watched go out. She knows how to work a room. She knows how to smile through the exhaustion and shake the right hands and say the right things. She is, in every sense of the word, the steady one. Then the doors at the back of the room open, and the atmosphere shifts in a way that's hard to put into words. It wasn't simply the fact that Robert Irwin had arrived. It was everything about how he arrived. If you grew up watching the Irwins, you carry a specific image of Robert in your head. The little boy in khakis 2 sizes too big. The kid with the bowl cut who was always hovering just behind his dad or trailing his big sister Bindi. He was the cute one in the background. The mini version of Steve. But the man who walked through those doors was nobody's background character. He had on a suit that actually fit. His hair was styled. And he carried himself with this quiet, undeniable authority that stopped people mid-conversation. Terri was standing off to the side, probably bracing herself for another round of polite small talk and the usual questions about the zoo. But the moment she spotted him, it hit her somewhere deep. She wasn't seeing the boy she had spent 20 years protecting anymore. She was seeing a man in his 20s who had just claimed an entire room without uttering a single word. Cameras swung toward him. Conversations dropped off. People turned. And it wasn't just the recognition factor. It was something harder to define. Presence. A gravity. Something entirely new. That was the moment Terri completely lost her composure. And here's the thing. This is a woman who has been through the kind of pain that would level most people. She has buried her husband, run a zoo, raised 2 kids under a global spotlight, and done it all without falling apart publicly. But seeing Robert like that, so completely and unmistakably himself, so grounded and so confident, it shattered something in her. Not from sadness. Not from missing Steve, though that undercurrent is always there. It broke her open because she was seeing proof that everything she had fought for had actually worked. Robert was moved too. He spoke publicly about his gratitude for his mother, and his voice cracked doing it. Terri described how Robert and Bindi had been the only reason she could get herself out of bed in those early years after losing Steve. The boy she had shielded from tabloids and tragedy and the crushing weight of a dead hero's name had finally stepped fully into his own light. He wasn't just getting through it anymore. He was thriving. He had taken a story that started in loss and rewritten it into something entirely his own. Standing under those gala lights, Robert Irwin was no longer simply the son of a legend. He was the man his mother had always dared to believe he would become, even if seeing it happen so quickly caught her completely off guard. But it went deeper than a good suit and a confident stride. The resemblance ran all the way to the bone. Put a photograph of Robert Irwin next to one of his father, and the similarity is almost startling. And we are not just talking about the blonde hair or the preference for khaki. It goes further than surface features. It is the stance, that wide, ready posture Steve always had, like he was permanently braced for something exciting to happen. It is the hands, always moving, always illustrating whatever point they are making with a kind of enthusiasm that cannot be faked. It is that particular squint they both get when the Australian sun catches them full in the face. For years, the public looked at Robert and saw a sequel. They wanted the Crocodile Hunter 2.0. They wanted the noise and the energy and the crikey, and they wanted it delivered by someone who shared the bloodline. For a child growing up with cameras permanently pointed at him, that is an almost unbearable amount of expectation to carry. But what Robert inherited went beyond the physical. He got the engine too. That restless electric energy Steve had, that conviction that every single moment of being alive is an extraordinary gift. Robert has it in equal measure. You can see it in the way he moves through the grounds at Australia Zoo. There is a frantic joy to it, a kind of beautiful impatience that is unmistakably Irwin. For Terri, though, living with that resemblance has never been simple. Think about what it means to look at your son's face every single morning and see the man you lost. Every laugh that sounds like his laugh. Every gesture that mirrors his gesture. It is, in the same breath, a comfort and a wound. Every time Robert goes toe-to-toe with a saltwater crocodile, he plants his feet exactly the way Steve did. A technique that was entirely Steve's own, developed over decades in the field. The public cannot get enough of it, and honestly, who can blame them? When Robert recreates one of his father's iconic moments, the same crocodile, the same enclosure years later, the internet loses its collective mind. It is nostalgic and emotional, and it works every single time. But the story behind the scenes is more complicated. Robert is not a replica. He is a young man who had to piece together his understanding of manhood by rewinding and replaying old footage of a father who was not there to teach him the everyday things. He had to learn Steve from archives. He had to study the ghost. Terri watched that process unfold over years. She saw him wrestle with the mini Steve label, sometimes fighting it, sometimes leaning into it strategically. But what she witnessed in that ballroom was the moment the echo finally found harmony with Robert's own distinct voice. He was no longer just reflecting his father. He was a man who resembled Steve in all the visible ways but was operating from an entirely different place. Where Steve was a force of nature, loud, kinetic, impossible to ignore, Robert is something quieter and just as powerful. He is the observer, the artist. He has the same fire, but he is aiming it somewhere different. The physical likeness is the thing that draws people in. But the character underneath is the real story. Robert has taken his father's outsized, larger-than-life persona and done something Steve never had the chance to do. He has evolved it. He has made the Irwin name feel relevant and fresh and, yes, genuinely cool to a generation that was not even born when the Crocodile Hunter was a cable television phenomenon. He is not running from his father's shadow. He is walking alongside it as an equal. And for someone in his mid-20s, that is a level of emotional maturity that most people never reach at any age. Then came the day when everything went silent. Cast your mind back to September 4, 2006. If you were old enough to be paying attention, you remember exactly where you were when the news came through. Steve Irwin was gone. Did not compute at first. It felt like a mistake, like a rumor that would get corrected within the hour. Steve was the guy who danced with the most dangerous creatures on the planet before most people had finished their morning coffee. He was supposed to be invincible. But for 8-year-old Bindi and 2-year-old Robert, none of that mythology mattered. He was not a television icon. He was not a global brand. He was Dad. And in a single moment nobody saw coming, the brightest and loudest presence in their small world simply stopped. The silence that settled over the Irwin family in the weeks that followed was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that physically weighs on you, that rings in your ears and sits on your chest. For Terri, the world did not just pause, it fractured. One day she was one half of the most recognized conservation partnership on the planet. The next, she was a widow with 2 children under the age of 10 and a sprawling, expensive wildlife park to keep alive. The grief was everywhere, and it was public, and it was relentless. Steve's face was on every screen, every front page, every conversation. But behind the closed doors of the family's private quarters at Australia Zoo, Terri was facing something that no amount of public sympathy could touch, the sheer, staggering weight of what came next. Robert was only 2 years old. He carries fragments of memory, not full pictures. A scent, a sound, the physical sensation of being lifted high. Most of what he knows about his father came not from lived experience but from a hard drive. From footage. From 4:3 aspect ratio home videos and documentary reels. While other boys his age were learning things from their dads firsthand, Robert was watching his father on a screen, studying the man through glass. He grew up in a home where the ghost of someone enormous lived in every hallway, smiled out from every photo frame, and quietly shaped every single conversation. The true tragedy of what the Irwin family lost is not just the man himself. It is the hollow space his absence carved out, a vacuum that could never quite be filled no matter how hard anyone tried. In those early years, Terri faced a choice that would define everything. She could have stepped back, sold the zoo, packed up the kids, found a quiet corner of Oregon, and let the Irwin name become a fond footnote. Nobody would have blamed her. The burden she was being asked to carry alone was genuinely crushing. But she looked at Robert, already crawling toward anything that moved, already drawn to every living creature he could find, and she understood that the flame could not be allowed to go out. She had to become everything at once. Mother, father, chief executive, guardian of a legacy the entire world felt entitled to. She had to do all of it while navigating a media landscape where people were actively waiting for the family to crumble. Those years were survival, pure and simple. Legal challenges, financial pressure, the constant low-level dread that Robert would grow up feeling obligated to become someone he was never meant to be just to satisfy an audience's expectations. Terri fought in the trenches of that battle every single day. She made sure that while the world was writing a tragedy, her son was living a future. She was doing something extraordinary. She was building a man out of the ruins of a legend. And she was doing it quietly, without credit, in the grieving corners of a zoo that the world had already started to eulogize. She did not just endure what happened. She became the architect of what came next. To understand how a 2-year-old who lost his father in the most public and brutal way imaginable grew into a composed, accomplished, genuinely grounded young man, you have to stop looking at Robert for a moment. You have to look at his mother. Terri Irwin did not simply survive widowhood. She constructed something out of it. Think about the sheer raw courage it takes to wake up the morning after the most famous man in your country, your husband, your partner, your person, dies, and realize that you are now solely responsible for a wildlife park, 2 grieving children, and a global brand that half the world wants a piece of. It was not about keeping the crocodiles fed. It was about keeping the soul of a family intact while the planet watched through a lens. Terri fought her war on 2 separate fronts. On one side, the business. Australia Zoo was not just a tourist attraction with ticket sales and gift shops. It was Steve's living dream, a sprawling, breathing monument to everything he believed in, and it cost millions to keep running. The rumor circulated for years that the zoo was in trouble, that the magic had left with Steve, that Terri would eventually admit defeat and head back to America. She did none of those things. She dug in. She took the meetings and signed the contracts and faced down the lawsuits and made the hard calls. She became the quiet, steely commercial backbone of an empire built on enthusiasm and khaki, doing it all with a composure that became her defining characteristic. It was a survival plan that had no business working as well as it did. On the other front was the job that mattered most, raising her children. This is where Terri's instincts as a mother proved remarkable. The easy move would have been to pull Robert and Bindi out of the spotlight entirely, to find them some version of a normal life away from cameras and conservation galas. But Terri understood something important. That ship had already sailed. Her children's faces were on merchandise. Their names were known globally. Removing them from public life would not have protected them. It would have just created a different kind of pressure. So instead, she found a way to shield them in full view. She made sure that every time Robert appeared on camera, it felt like play rather than performance. She built a bubble of normalcy inside the chaos, and she stood guard at the entrance of it, making absolutely certain that the tabloid narrative of the tragic orphan never got close enough to touch him. Away from the cameras, she was doing something even harder. She was teaching a boy how to become a man without a father in the house. She never pretended to be Steve. She never tried to fill that particular space, because she understood it could not be filled. What she did instead was make Steve's values the invisible architecture of their everyday life. She taught Robert that real strength looked like kindness. She made it clear that the path everyone expected him to walk, the reckless daredevil, the adrenaline junkie, the crocodile hunter reborn, was one option, not a requirement. She gave him room to be still, to be curious and nerdy and artistic, to move at his own pace and find his own answers. She was the one who sat with the hard questions on the hard nights, and she was the one who made absolutely sure her son understood that his last name was a gift, not a cage. By the time Robert hit his teenage years, the foundation was solid. Terri had built something that could actually hold weight. She had turned what could easily have been a slow-motion collapse into something that looked, from the outside, almost effortless. When people saw her watching Robert in that ballroom, they saw a proud mother. What they were really seeing was a commander surveying a battlefield she had spent 2 decades navigating. She had kept the zoo alive. She had protected the legacy. And most importantly, she had saved the boy. She did not just outlast the tragedy. She outworked it completely. He had finally discovered a world where he could do the seeing, not just be seen. If you want to understand Robert Irwin's transformation at its most fundamental level, you have to start with a camera. But not the ones that had been pointed at him his entire life. 4 years, Robert existed as the subject. He was the kid in the frame, directed where to stand and how to hold the snake and when to look excited for the crew. He was extraordinarily good at being observed. But somewhere in his early teenage years, something in him quietly shifted. He no longer wanted to be the one in front of the glass. He wanted to be behind it. He picked up a digital SLR and began to shoot, and what emerged was something that genuinely nobody had seen coming. Not just competent photography for someone his age. Not charming efforts from a famous kid with access to interesting animals. World-class wildlife photography. Full stop. This was not a hobby designed to keep him busy between zoo segments. Photography became the private language Robert had been searching for his entire life. Consider the particular difficulty of finding your own voice when the man you are constantly compared to was one of the loudest, most kinetic, most overwhelming personalities in the history of television. How do you carve out a sound of your own when you're standing in the acoustic shadow of a human hurricane? You do it by going quiet. You do it by waking before dawn and sitting perfectly motionless in a hide for hours, waiting for a rare bird to settle or a predator to make its move. While Steve Irwin was celebrated for the action, the wrestling, the shouting, the barely controlled chaos, Robert found his power in the opposite of all that. In stillness, in patience, in the art of watching. He discovered a way to love the same animals his father had loved while approaching them from a completely different angle. Terri watched the shift happen with equal parts relief and fascination. She saw her son stop performing and start creating. When Robert began collecting serious recognition, including the Natural History Museum's Wildlife Photographer of the Year People's Choice Award, it was not just a trophy on a shelf. It was a declaration. It was Robert announcing to anyone paying attention that he had his own way of seeing the world, and it was worth looking at. He began traveling, moving from the ice sheets of Antarctica to the dense canopies of Africa, producing work that felt sophisticated and considered and entirely his own. He was not trying to be a television character. He was becoming a genuine artist. This phase of his development was the first time the public started to see Robert as something other than a legacy act. He wasn't the kid with the famous last name anymore. He was the photographer who could compress an entire dying ecosystem into a single, devastating frame. That distinction mattered enormously for his sense of self. In photography, your family connections do not improve your composition. Your name does not sharpen your eye. You either see it or you don't. Robert proved again and again that he saw it. He was quietly constructing a bridge between the conservation message his father had spent his life broadcasting and a younger, visually driven audience that responds to beauty and craft as much as to urgency. By 17, he was no longer just Steve's son with a camera. He was a legitimate creative force. He had found a way to be fully part of the Irwin mission without feeling like a photocopy of someone else. He was adding something original, something personal, something that had never existed in the family's story before. Terri would watch him sit at his computer for hours, losing himself in the editing process with a focus and intensity that reminded her powerfully of Steve, just directed at a completely different kind of screen. He had found the place where he could be the one doing the observing. And in that quiet, deliberate observation, he had finally located the man he was meant to be. The transformation, though, was only just hitting its stride. If the photography represented the quiet, interior foundation of Robert's evolution, what came next was something else entirely: a full cultural eruption. The moment the boy from the zoo stepped into the frame, not as a legacy act but as a genuine powerhouse in his own right. Over the past couple of years, Robert did not simply grow up. He arrived. He became a fashion campaign face, a primetime television host, and the internet's collective favorite wholesome obsession, all more or less simultaneously. The Irwin name, which had spent years operating primarily as a nostalgia vehicle, suddenly felt current, urgent even. Robert was not just keeping the brand alive. He was dragging it into an era nobody had imagined for it. And at the center of it all was a new kind of public masculinity, thoughtful, warm, physically capable, and completely unashamed, that audiences were hungry for in a way they had not even realized. The clearest turning point came during the 2024 to 2025 period. The man who had spent his life in sun-faded khakis and muddy boots started appearing in major brand campaigns, Bonds, Columbia Sportswear, with a photogenic ease that genuinely caught the media off guard. He was not just the wildlife guy awkwardly placed in front of a backdrop. He owned it. The internet responded with a kind of collective enthusiasm that is almost impossible to manufacture, and he reached an entirely new audience in the process. A Gen Z generation that may never have watched a single episode of The Crocodile Hunter but absolutely followed his social media presence. He demonstrated something valuable and somewhat rare: that you can be physically tough, deeply committed to a serious cause, and still care about how you present yourself to the world. That these things are not in conflict. Then television opened up in a way nobody had quite anticipated. When the announcement came that Robert would be co-hosting I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, alongside Julia Morris, the skeptics were vocal. Could someone that young genuinely hold a primetime slot? The skeptics were answered quickly and definitively. He was a natural. The Irwin energy was there, that same warmth and enthusiasm and genuine delight in the unpredictable, but filtered through a modern wit and self-awareness that felt completely his own. He followed that with Dancing with the Stars in Hollywood in late 2025. Watching him claim the Mirrorball trophy was one of those full-circle television moments that genuinely earns the description, particularly because Bindi had stood in the same spot a decade earlier. By the time the final aired, Robert had crossed from being Australia's favorite son into something broader. America had decided it wanted him too. Terri was watching all of this from a particular kind of distance, close enough to feel every moment of it, far enough back to see the whole picture. The scale of what was happening to her son was extraordinary. Major network conversations. Paychecks that reportedly reached into the millions for single engagements. A meeting with Prince William. A wax figure at Madame Tussauds. And yet the same person fielding all of these offers was flying back to Queensland the following morning to help a giraffe give birth. That detail matters. This was not a celebrity transformation driven by ego or ambition in the conventional sense. It was an expansion, a deliberate, values-anchored broadening of the Irwin mission into territory Steve never had the chance to explore. By early 2026, Robert had done something genuinely difficult. He had navigated extreme and sudden fame without losing himself in it. No scandals. No visible casualties. Just a steadily growing presence and an increasingly clear sense of purpose. Even the small things carried weight now. A mustache in a particular style became a national conversation. Everything he did had developed its own gravitational pull. He was no longer holding on to the legacy by his fingertips. He was the one steering it, pushing it forward, making it mean something to people who had no prior connection to it. He had stopped trying to look like his father and started standing beside him, as a peer, as a successor, as his own man entirely. The one thing that never changed was what happened when the cameras turned off. When the events end and the lights go down and the photographers pack up and leave, the Irwins return to something the public rarely gets to see. A world that exists inside Australia Zoo that has nothing to do with branding or conservation campaigns or social media reach. A world that is, at its core, just a mother and her son. For nearly 2 decades, it has been the two of them and Bindi, navigating something that most families never have to face, and doing it with the eyes of the world permanently trained on them. The real work of Robert's transformation did not happen on red carpets or television sets. It happened in a kitchen, over cups of tea late at night. On long drives through the Queensland bush where there was no audience and no performance required. That is where the actual heavy lifting got done. Terri has always been Robert's most important relationship. His sounding board, his strategic partner, his most trusted advisor. The level of trust that developed between them is not a standard parent-child dynamic. Goes beyond that. From the time Robert was a teenager, Terri brought him into the actual decision-making of the zoo. Its future direction, its global partnerships, the shape of the conservation mission going forward. She did not manage him or protect him from the complexity of it. She prepared him for it. She treated him from early on as the person who would one day be responsible for all of it. That approach created something unusual in the world of celebrity families. A genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and a completely shared sense of purpose. They are not two people who happen to share a name and a zip code. They are two pillars holding up the same structure. The emotional dimension of that bond is what really explains the scene in the gala. Terri is the only person alive who fully understands what it cost Robert to become the man who walked into that room. She saw it all. The exhaustion underneath the confidence during the periods when he was commuting between film commitments and zoo responsibilities. The private moments of doubt. The quiet wonder of whether he would ever be perceived as anything beyond the extension of someone else's story. She did not just observe those struggles from a caring distance. She lived them alongside him, because she was carrying a version of the same weight herself. They have spent 20 years navigating the presence of Steve together. His absence, his memory, his legacy, in a conversation that has never really ended and does not need to be explained to anyone outside it. In the years since Robert moved into adulthood, something has shifted in the dynamic between them. The roles have gently redistributed. He is the one now who reaches back to help her across the difficult terrain. The one who calls on the anniversaries that still carry pain. The one who makes sure she is seen and celebrated as an individual, a woman with her own extraordinary story, rather than simply as the widow of someone famous. He watched her sacrifice her personal life entirely to make his possible. And when he stepped onto that gala floor as a self-possessed, confident, fully realized adult, it was the most profound kind of thank you he could have offered. It was proof that the gamble she had taken, the decision to stay, to fight, to build, had paid off completely. She had not just raised a public figure. She had raised a man who could stand beside her as a genuine equal. What makes the Irwin family remarkable is not the fame or the animals or the conservation mission. As extraordinary as all of those things are, it is this: they actually like each other. They are a tight unit held together not just by shared loss but by shared strength, by mutual respect, by a specific kind of love that has been tested repeatedly and has not cracked. That is the transformation beneath all the other transformations. The one where a small boy who lost everything became the person his mother could finally lean on. The full weight of everything they had built together was only now beginning to land. When you look back at that ballroom scene with clear eyes, the tears make complete sense. They were not about the suit. They were not about the entrance. They were the release valve on 20 years of sustained, exhausting, often invisible effort. Terri stood in that room and watched her son move through it. Poised, warm, magnetic, fully present, and she saw something she had been working toward since 2006 without ever being entirely sure she would reach it. The finish line of the hardest race she had ever run. She had not just preserved Steve's memory.